Montana Territory, 1880. The harsh winter wind whipped across the snow-dusted plains of Wolf Creek as Xavier Wade pulled his wool coat tighter around his lean frame. At 25, he had already spent 7 years riding the range, his face weathered just enough to show character while maintaining the smooth features of youth. His dark blonde hair curled slightly beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and the light stubble on his jaw did little to hide the strong line of his chin or the slight dimple centered there. Xavier believed one truth above all others: attachment was a luxury a cowboy could not afford. The West demanded everything a man had to give, and splitting your focus between survival and sentiment was a sure path to an early grave. He had seen it happen too many times. Good men distracted by thoughts of home and hearth when they should have been watching for rustlers or quicksand or any of the 1,000 other ways the frontier could kill you. "Wade," the foreman's voice carried across the ranch yard, "take those supplies into town. Old man Calloway needs feed for his stock before this storm hits full." Xavier nodded, grateful for the task. The isolation of the trail suited him better than the bunkhouse camaraderie. Out there, a man only had to worry about himself. As he loaded the wagon, Xavier calculated how much time he had before the storm. If he pushed hard, he could make it to Wolf Creek and back before the worst hit. He climbed onto the seat, took the reins, and snapped them over the backs of the team. The 10-mile journey into town gave him time to think. At the Rocking W, he had work, food, and shelter, everything a man needed. The other hands occasionally rode into town for women and whiskey, but Xavier mostly stayed behind. His parents had died of fever when he was 16, and since then he had learned that people were temporary. The land endured, but people always left, one way or another. Wolf Creek appeared on the horizon, a collection of wooden structures huddled against the coming storm. Xavier guided the wagon down the muddy main street, past the saloon where piano music already spilled into the afternoon air, and toward Calloway's general store. He had just begun unloading sacks of feed when the bell above the store door jingled. A young woman stepped out, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Xavier paused, a heavy sack balanced against his shoulder. She was perhaps 22, with honey blonde hair pulled back in a practical but becoming style. Her blue calico dress, while simple, was carefully tailored to fit her slender frame. But it was her face that caused Xavier to nearly drop his load, heart-shaped, with high cheekbones and wide, intelligent blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Excuse me," she said, noticing his stare. "Are you bringing supplies for Mr. Calloway?" Xavier cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am, feed and such from the Rocking W." She nodded and started to move past, but then paused. The storm's coming in faster than expected. "You might want to finish quickly." Before Xavier could respond, she continued down the boardwalk, the hem of her dress swishing against her ankles. He watched her go, noticing how people nodded respectfully as she passed. She was someone of standing in Wolf Creek, that much was clear. "That's Miss Rebecca Chandler," Old Man Calloway said, appearing at Xavier's side. "Schoolteacher, came out from Boston about 6 months ago." Xavier grunted noncommittally and returned to unloading the wagon. But his eyes kept drifting down the street to where the blue dress had disappeared around a corner. He finished the delivery just as the first heavy snowflakes began to fall. The wind had picked up considerably, driving the snow horizontally across the street. Xavier knew he couldn't make it back to the ranch. He would have to stay in town. "No rooms at the boarding house," the saloon keeper informed him when Xavier inquired. "Storms trap too many travelers. You can bed down in the back room here if you're quiet about it." Xavier nodded his thanks and found a corner table where he could nurse a whiskey and wait out the evening. The saloon filled as the storm intensified, cowboys and townspeople alike seeking warmth and company. The door burst open with a gust of snow, and Xavier looked up to see Rebecca Chandler enter, shaking snow from her shawl. She scanned the room anxiously. "Miss Chandler," the barkeeper called, "you shouldn't be out in this." "I know, Mr. Donovan, but the school roof started leaking, and I need to find Mr. Peterson to fix it before my books are ruined." Her voice carried above the noise, cultured but not pretentious, with a slight tremor from the cold. Xavier found himself on his feet before he'd consciously decided to move. "I could take a look at it for you, ma'am. I've patched a roof or two." She turned toward him, recognition dawning in her eyes. The delivery man from earlier, I couldn't possibly impose. "No imposition." Not going anywhere in this storm anyway. He grabbed his coat from the back of his chair. Something like relief crossed her face. Thank you, Mr. Wade, Xavier Wade. He put on his hat. Lead the way, Miss Chandler. They battled the storm together, the short distance to the schoolhouse feeling much longer against the driving snow. Inside, water dripped steadily from a corner of the ceiling onto a stack of books that Rebecca had pushed aside. It just started an hour ago, she explained, removing her wet shawl. I moved what I could, but there are so many books. Xavier examined the leak. Looks like ice damming, common enough. I can clear it, but I'll need to get up on the roof. In this weather, that seems dangerous. More dangerous to let water destroy your schoolhouse. He shrugged out of his coat. You got a ladder. Working in the storm was treacherous, but Xavier had faced worse. He cleared the ice dam and patched the leak from both outside and in. When he finally climbed down, soaked and freezing, Rebecca was waiting with a cup of steaming coffee. I keep a pot on the stove for cold mornings, she explained, handing it to him. You must be freezing. Xavier accepted the coffee gratefully, his fingers brushing against hers in the exchange. He noticed her left hand then, specifically, the way she unconsciously touched her ring finger with her thumb, rotating an invisible band. The gesture was quick, practiced, like a habit formed from years of wearing a ring that was no longer there. You saved my books, Mr. Wade. I'm very grateful. She gathered several volumes from the floor, cradling them protectively. Just Xavier is fine. He sipped the coffee, watching her. You're not from around here. No, she smiled slightly. Is it that obvious? You handle those books like they're made of gold. Rebecca laughed, a sound that seemed to brighten the dreary schoolhouse. Knowledge is more valuable than gold out here, wouldn't you say? These children have so little access to the wider world. Xavier had never thought about it that way. Books had always seemed impractical luxuries to him, unnecessary weight for a man who moved with the seasons and the work. What brought you to Montana Territory, Miss Chandler? Most Eastern folks avoid places this rough. Her hand stilled on the books, and that unconscious gesture returned, thumb to ring finger, a quick, circular motion. A change of scenery, she said simply, and please call me Rebecca. They talked as the storm howled outside, Xavier helping her reorganize the classroom while she explained her teaching methods. He found himself oddly captivated by her enthusiasm, the way her eyes lit up when discussing her students or describing a favorite author. You should join us for a lesson sometime, she suggested. The children would be fascinated by your experiences on the range. Xavier chuckled, not much educational about pushing cows, Miss Rebecca. On the contrary, geography, natural history, meteorology, you use all these sciences daily, whether you recognize it or not. She glanced out the window. The storm's letting up. I should get back to my boarding house before it starts again. Xavier escorted her through the snow-covered streets. At the boarding house steps, she turned to him. Thank you again for your help, Xavier. I mean it. Something in her genuine gratitude pierced through his carefully maintained distance. My pleasure, Rebecca. Good night. He tipped his hat and walked away, unsettled by the warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Xavier prepared to return to the ranch, loading his wagon and settling accounts with Calloway. He told himself he wasn't lingering in hopes of seeing the schoolteacher again. When he finally spotted her crossing the street toward the schoolhouse, a group of children trailing behind her like ducklings, he surprised himself by calling out, Miss Chandler. She turned, shading her eyes against the morning sun. Mr. Wade, are you leaving? Heading back to the rocking W, he hesitated, roof holding up. Perfectly, thank you. She seemed about to say more when one of the children tugged at her sleeve, whispering something. Rebecca smiled and nodded. Actually, Mr. Wade, would you consider accepting my invitation from yesterday? The children are very curious about ranch life. Xavier looked at the eager young faces. It would delay his return by an hour at most. I suppose I could spare some time. What he had expected to be a brief visit turned into a morning of questions, demonstrations of rope work, and explanations of cattle brands. Rebecca watched from her desk, a small smile playing at her lips as Xavier found himself warming to the role of teacher. When noon approached, Xavier reluctantly gathered his things. I really should get back. The foreman will be wondering where I disappeared to. Of course, Rebecca walked him to the door while the children ate their midday meals. You have a natural way with them. They responded to you wonderfully. Xavier felt a flush of pride he hadn't expected. They're good kids. You're doing important work here. In the doorway, something made him bold enough to ask, will you be at the town social this Saturday? I heard some of the ladies mention it. Rebecca's hand went to her ring finger again, that same unconscious motion. I hadn't planned to, but... She looked up at him, something vulnerable in her expression. Perhaps I will. Xavier nodded, strangely satisfied. Then perhaps I'll see you there. The ride back to the Rocking W gave him too much time to think. Why had he invited himself to a town social? He never attended such functions. And why did the schoolteacher's habit of touching her ring finger bother him so much? It was clear she'd been engaged or married before. That was none of his business. Yet as he approached the ranch, Xavier found himself making mental calculations about whether he could reasonably request Saturday evening off. The thought of seeing Rebecca again created an anticipation he hadn't felt in years, and that was dangerous. Attachments were liabilities in the unpredictable West. He had learned that lesson well. But when Saturday arrived, Xavier found himself riding toward Wolf Creek anyway, wearing his one good shirt and with his boots polished to a shine. The town hall buzzed with activity, tables laden with food, a small band playing in the corner, lanterns casting a warm glow over the proceedings. Xavier hesitated in the doorway, feeling suddenly out of place. Mr. Wade, a familiar voice called. You came. Rebecca approached, wearing a dress of deep green that brought out the gold flecks in her blue eyes. Her hair was arranged more elaborately than he had seen before, with a few curls framing her face. Said I might, he replied, removing his hat. You look, words failed him momentarily. Nice. Real nice. A slight blush colored her cheeks. Thank you, would you like some punch? They fell into easy conversation as they sipped their drinks. Xavier learned that Rebecca had come to Montana after answering an advertisement for a teacher. She spoke of her parents back east, her training at a women's college, her love of literature. But whenever the conversation drifted toward anything more personal, past suitors, reasons for coming west, she gently redirected. When the band struck up a lively reel, Xavier surprised himself again. Would you care to dance, Miss Chandler? Her hand went to her ring finger, that telling gesture, but then she smiled. I would, Mr. Wade. They danced 3 sets, Xavier discovering that years of physical work had made him light on his feet. Rebecca laughed when he spun her, her green skirt swirling around her ankles. For those brief minutes, Xavier forgot his rules about keeping his distance, forgot the dangers of caring too much. He simply enjoyed the music, the movement, and the warmth of Rebecca's hand in his. As the evening progressed, Xavier noticed other men watching Rebecca. She was clearly well respected in the community. Why hadn't she been claimed already? The answer seemed to lie in that unconscious gesture, that phantom ring she still felt on her finger. When the dance ended, Rebecca excused herself to speak with some of the mothers from her school. Xavier found himself cornered by the blacksmith, a burly man named Johnson. Saw you dancing with Miss Chandler, Johnson remarked, eyeing Xavier over his punch cup. She's a fine lady, too fine to be left alone out here. She seems capable enough, Xavier replied carefully. Oh, capable as they come. But lonely, lost her fiancé back east, you know. Came out here to escape the memories, from what I hear. Johnson shook his head. Shame, man must have been something special to win a lady like that. Xavier's eyes found Rebecca across the room, laughing with an older woman. So there had been someone she still mourned, if that ring-finger gesture was any indication. Someone she loved was still out there, perhaps not in body but certainly in her heart. The knowledge shouldn't have disappointed him as much as it did. The band struck up a slower tune and Xavier saw his chance. He crossed to Rebecca and offered his hand. One more before I head back. They moved together to the gentle waltz, and Xavier found the courage to ask, How long have you been in Wolf Creek now? 6 months next Tuesday, she answered. Though sometimes it feels like I arrived yesterday, and other times like I've always been here. And before that, Boston, you said. Rebecca nodded, her gaze drifting over his shoulder. Yes. I taught at a private academy there. Quite a change coming out here. I needed one, The simplicity of her answer held volumes of unspoken pain. Xavier took a chance. Johnson mentioned you were engaged once. Her step faltered slightly, but she recovered. People talk in small towns. They do. Rebecca was quiet for several measures. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but steady. His name was Thomas. He was a doctor. He died 3 years ago during a typhoid outbreak, treating patients until he became one himself. Her hand went to her ring finger again. I thought I would never leave Boston. His grave is there, you see. But eventually, I realized I was haunting places we had been together rather than living my own life. Xavier tightened his grip on her waist slightly, an instinctive gesture of support. I'm sorry. As am I, she met his eyes directly, but Montana has been, healing the openness of it, the possibility, my students. A small smile touched her lips. And occasionally, kind cowboys who fix leaking roofs. The music ended and they stood for a moment, still connected. Xavier felt an unfamiliar tightening in his chest, empathy mixed with something warmer, more dangerous. I should go, he said reluctantly. Early start tomorrow. Rebecca walked with him to the door. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead. Thank you for the dances, Xavier. She stood with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, looking up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. My pleasure, he settled his hat on his head. Perhaps I could call on you sometime, proper like I mean. Her hand went to her ring finger, but this time she seemed to catch herself doing it. She deliberately lowered her hand. I would like that. Xavier rode back to the rocking W with his thoughts in turmoil. Rebecca Chandler was still in love with a ghost. That much was clear from her unconscious gestures, the way she protected her heart. And yet she had agreed to see him again. Was she ready to move forward, or was he setting himself up for disappointment? More importantly, why did he suddenly care? He had built his entire adult life around avoiding attachments. The frontier was no place for sentiment. Caring for someone meant giving them the power to destroy you when they inevitably left, whether by choice, circumstance, or death. But as the miles passed beneath his horse's hooves, Xavier found himself planning his next trip to Wolf Creek. Over the next 2 months, Xavier found reasons to visit town whenever possible. He attended the school's Christmas pageant, helped repair benches for the church social, and volunteered to deliver supplies when other hands were available. Each time he found his way to Rebecca's side, their conversations growing deeper, their understanding of each other expanding. He learned that she loved poetry but hated arithmetic, that she could play the piano beautifully but couldn't carry a tune when singing, that she dreamed of someday starting a proper library for Wolf Creek. She discovered his secret love of reading despite his limited formal education, his skill with horses, and his dry sense of humor that rarely emerged around others. Yet always there remained that barrier, the unconscious touch to her ring finger whenever conversation veered toward the future, the careful way she kept a certain emotional distance. Winter deepened into February, and Xavier found himself thinking of Rebecca even when miles away on the range. Her smile, her laugh, the way she tilted her head when listening to her students, these images followed him through long days of work and longer nights in the bunkhouse. On a bitter cold evening, Xavier sat on his bunk penning a letter. His bunkmate, an older cowhand named Harley, glanced over curiously. You writing a letter, Wade? Didn't know you had family. Just correspondence, Xavier replied, protective of his privacy. Harley chuckled knowingly. Must be the schoolmarm. Boy's been talking about how often you find your way to town lately. Xavier looked up sharply. That a problem? Not to me, Harley shrugged, but you might want to consider if it's fair to her. What's that supposed to mean? Means you're a cowboy. Come spring roundup, you could be hired out to any outfit between here and Kansas. That's no life for a woman like her. Schoolteachers need stability. Harley pulled on his boots. And from what I hear, she's already lost one man. Wouldn't be right to make her face that again. The words struck Xavier like a physical blow. Harley was right. What did he have to offer Rebecca? A life of uncertainty, separation, and possibly early widowhood. The frontier claimed cowboys young. He had no land, no home beyond the bunkhouse, nothing stable to build a life upon. Perhaps her unconscious resistance, that protective gesture toward her ring finger, was wisdom rather than lingering attachment. Perhaps she sensed what he was only now realizing, that some distances couldn't be bridged by good intentions alone. Xavier crumpled the letter and tossed it into the stove. Harley watched but said nothing. When the spring thaw came, bringing mud season and preparations for roundup, Xavier threw himself into work. He avoided town for 3 weeks, telling himself he was giving Rebecca the chance to find someone more suitable. A shopkeeper, perhaps, or a rancher with his own spread. Someone who could offer her more than fleeting visits between cattle drives. But when the foreman announced another supply run to Wolf Creek, Xavier volunteered before he could talk himself out of it. He told himself he would just check on her, make sure she was well, nothing more. Wolf Creek had awakened from its winter slumber. The streets bustled with activity, and new construction had begun on the north end of town. Xavier completed his deliveries efficiently, but hesitated before heading to the schoolhouse. Instead, he found himself at the small cemetery on the edge of town, hat in hand, staring at the freshly turned earth of a new grave. The marker was simple: Sarah Williams, beloved wife and mother, 1855-1880. Childbirth, a voice said behind him. Xavier turned to find Rebecca standing there, a small bunch of wildflowers in her hands. Her husband is one of the homesteaders north of town, 3 children now without a mother. Xavier nodded, uncertain what to say. Rebecca placed her flowers on the grave and straightened. "I missed you," she said simply. "You stopped coming to town." "Been busy, spring roundup coming." "I see," she studied his face. "Will you walk with me?" They followed the path back toward town in silence. Finally, Rebecca spoke. "Have I done something to offend you, Xavier?" "No," he said quickly, "nothing like that." "Then why the sudden absence? I thought we were becoming." She trailed off, seemingly unable to define exactly what they were becoming. Xavier stopped walking. "What future do you see for us, Rebecca?" "Really?" She looked startled by the directness of his question. "I hadn't. That is, I enjoy your company greatly." "And I yours, but I'm a cowhand. I go where the work is. That's no life for someone like you." Rebecca's eyes flashed. "Someone like me, and what am I like exactly?" "Educated, refined, deserving of stability." He gestured toward the town. "You've built something here. I can't ask you to give that up." "I don't recall you asking me anything," she said, her voice tight. Xavier ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "You're Thomas. He could offer you a proper life, a home, security, respect. I have none of those things to give." At the mention of her fiancé, Rebecca's hand went to her ring finger, that telling gesture Xavier had come to both recognize and dread. But this time she seemed aware of the motion. She deliberately lowered her hand. "Thomas is dead," she said quietly. "I loved him, yes, I probably always will in some corner of my heart. But he is gone and I am still here." She took a step closer to Xavier. "I came west to find a new life, not to hide from living. And yes, I touch my finger where his ring used to be, a habit I'm trying to break because it belongs to a past I cannot change." Xavier looked away, unable to meet the intensity in her eyes. "I have nothing, Rebecca." "You have yourself, your honor, your kindness." She touched his arm lightly. "That's not nothing, Xavier." Before he could respond, shouts erupted from the direction of town. They turned to see people running toward the northern end of the street. "Fire!" someone yelled. "The Williams place is on fire." Xavier and Rebecca exchanged a horrified glance. The Williams homestead, where the newly widowed father and his 3 children lived. Without a word, they both began running toward the commotion. The small cabin at the edge of town was engulfed in flames. A crowd had gathered, passing buckets of water that seemed pitifully inadequate against the blaze. "The children," a woman screamed. "John went in for the baby, but he hasn't come out." Xavier assessed the situation quickly. The front of the cabin was completely consumed, but the back wall was only beginning to burn. Without hesitation, he stripped off his coat and dashed around to the rear of the structure. "Xavier, no!" Rebecca's cry followed him, but he was already breaking through a back window, using his bandana as a makeshift mask against the smoke. Inside, the heat was overwhelming. Smoke filled the small space, making it nearly impossible to see. Xavier dropped to his knees, crawling through what appeared to be a bedroom. "Williams," he shouted. "Where are you?" A faint coughing from his left guided him toward a corner where John Williams crouched, clutching an infant to his chest. 2 small children huddled beside him, terror in their eyes. "Back window," Xavier gasped, the smoke searing his lungs. "Now." He scooped up one child while Williams gathered the other. Together they staggered toward the window Xavier had broken. The flames were spreading quickly, consuming the dry wood of the cabin walls. Xavier pushed the first child through the window into waiting arms outside. The second followed quickly. Williams passed the baby out next. But as Xavier turned to follow, a burning beam crashed down, blocking his path to the window. Outside, Rebecca watched in horror as 3 children and their father emerged from the inferno, but no Xavier. The flames had engulfed nearly the entire structure now. Surely no one could survive inside. "Xavier," she screamed, rushing toward the building only to be held back by the blacksmith. "Too dangerous, Miss Chandler," he insisted. "Building's about to collapse." As if confirming his words, a section of roof caved in with a thunderous crash. Rebecca's hands flew to her mouth, a sob escaping her throat. Not again, not another man she cared for lost forever. Then through the smoke and flame at the side of the building, a figure emerged, crawling, coughing violently, but alive. Xavier had found another way out, squeezing through what must have been a root cellar entrance. Rebecca broke free from the blacksmith's grip and ran to him. Xavier's face was blackened with soot, his hair singed, his clothes smoking in places. But his eyes were open, focusing on her as she dropped to her knees beside him. "Fool man," she sobbed, helping him move away from the burning building. "Reckless, stubborn fool." Xavier managed a weak smile. "Children," he rasped. "Safe, all safe." She cradled his head in her lap as others brought water. "Why would you do something so dangerous?" Xavier closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength to speak. "Couldn't stand by, not when I could help." As the town doctor examined him, determining that his injuries, while painful, were not life-threatening, Rebecca remained at Xavier's side. When they carried him to the doctor's office for further treatment, she walked alongside, her hand firmly clasping his. Later, as Xavier rested on the doctor's cot, Rebecca sat beside him, applying salve to his burned hands. "You could have died," she said softly, her earlier anger giving way to gentler concern. "Seemed worth the risk." He winced as she touched a particularly sensitive spot. "Those children already lost their mother. Couldn't let them lose their father, too." Rebecca's hands stilled. "Is that how you see the world, Xavier, in terms of what's worth the risk?" He considered her question seriously. "I suppose so. A man has to know what he's willing to die for. And what he's willing to live for." "And what are you willing to live for?" Her eyes held his, unwaveringly direct. Xavier took a deep breath, ignoring the pain in his smoke-damaged lungs. "Been thinking on that. Used to be I just lived day to day, taking what came. Figured attachment was a fool's game in a place this harsh." He flexed his bandaged fingers carefully. "But seeing Williams go back for his children, knowing he'd die before leaving them, made me understand something." Rebecca waited, her expression softening. "The frontier's harsh, yes. But facing it alone isn't wisdom, it's fear." Xavier reached for her hand. "Those children are worth the risk, that family is worth rebuilding for, and you, Rebecca, you're worth changing for." Her eyes filled with tears. "What are you saying, Xavier?" "I'm saying I've been a coward, pushing you away because I was scared of what might happen, scared of not being enough, scared of loving someone who still touches her ring finger when she thinks of the future." He held her gaze steadily. "But I'd rather risk heartbreak than never know what we might build together." Rebecca's hand went to her ring finger automatically, that gesture that had become so familiar to him. But this time she caught herself and deliberately placed her hand over his bandaged one instead. "Thomas will always be part of who I am," she said quietly. "He taught me how to love, but that chapter is finished, Xavier. I've been afraid too, afraid to trust that I could find happiness again, afraid to fully let go of the past. But today, watching that building burn, believing you were gone," her voice broke, "I realized I've found something worth risking my heart for again." Xavier sat up despite the doctor's orders, drawing her closer. "I have nothing to offer but myself, Rebecca. No land, no fortune. Just a cowboy with burned hands and big dreams. That's everything I need." She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "And perhaps those dreams could include staying in one place. Wolf Creek needs a marshal. The town council mentioned it just last week." Xavier blinked in surprise. "A marshal, me?" "Why not? You're honest, brave, respected. You've proven you'll risk yourself for others." She smiled. "And the position comes with living quarters above the office." Living quarters that might suit a marshal and a schoolteacher, Xavier asked, hope rising in his chest. Rebecca blushed beautifully, perhaps in time with proper courtship, of course. Of course, he agreed solemnly, though his eyes twinkled. Though I seem to recall we've already had quite a few chaperone meetings. True, she glanced at his bandaged hands. But I think we should wait until you can at least hold a prayer book without wincing. Xavier laughed, then coughed painfully. When he recovered, he said, I've waited my whole life to find something worth staying for. I can wait a bit longer to make it official. 2 months later, with his hands healed and a marshal's badge pinned to his chest, Xavier Wade stood before the pastor of Wolf Creek's small church. The building was filled to capacity, ranchers, townsfolk, and most importantly, 30 schoolchildren dressed in their Sunday best. When Rebecca appeared at the back of the church, a vision in ivory silk, Xavier felt his breath catch. She walked toward him with steady steps, her eyes never leaving his face. In her hands, she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, the same kind she had placed on Sarah Williams' grave the day that had changed everything. As she reached his side, Xavier noticed something remarkable. Throughout the entire ceremony, as they spoke their vows and exchanged rings, Rebecca's hands remained steady. Not once did her fingers drift to where Thomas's ring had once been. Instead, she held Xavier's hands firmly in hers, her new wedding band catching the light as they turned to face their future, together, unafraid, and at last, completely present in the life they had chosen to build. Wolf Creek, Montana territory had given Xavier Wade something he never expected to find on the frontier. Not just survival, but a reason to truly live. And Rebecca Chandler Wade had finally released the ghost of what might have been, embracing instead the love that stood before her, scarred, imperfect, but undeniably real. As they walked out of the church into the bright June sunshine, surrounded by well-wishers, Xavier leaned close to his new wife's ear. No regrets. Rebecca smiled up at him, her eyes clear and certain. Not one, she said, and reached for his hand, her left in his right, wedding bands touching, a new gesture to replace the old.